good to see everyone today. It's a privilege to be here to speak with you. So I've been working with wheat since 2007. Started graduate work and actually with soft winter wheat. So I've worked with wheat for quite a few years now. And so my team and I, we fulfill three different roles, I would say, for the wheat industry in Michigan. When I say my team, I've got a group of 4 graduate students and two technicians that work in the field and in the greenhouse. And so we do research on yield potential and human health and nutrition related traits. These are a lot of mics here. I got to get myself situated. We also do variety development. So we're always pushing yield potential. We're always crossing the best with the best or the best with the traits that we're interested in. Of course, yield potential, disease resistance are the two big ones, right? So I've learned a lot today actually about production and the actual inputs and what it takes to grow a good wheat crop from a management perspective. Different rates of nitrogen, different fungicide regimen. So all of these things are part of the whole package, and even marketing. It would take me years to learn what you all in this room know and practice every day in terms of the marketing end of things. So I think an often overlooked part of a management package is the variety itself. And wheat's a fun crop to work with because you can push it. You can do a lot of things with wheat. Wheat will respond to all these different management practices. But I want to talk about some of the attributes to be looking for in those wheat varieties to grow on your farm. They're all different, just as every one of you looks different in this room. We test 90 to 100 different wheat varieties in Michigan each year, and they all behave differently in terms of their yield and their specific traits. So first, I want to start off by giving you all a high five here. You're doing a great job in the national perspective here. Michigan is the largest soft wheat producer in the eastern U.S. Last year's numbers, we're up 570,000 acres, and so we're right on par with Missouri in terms of total acres. And what I'd really like to get to is the production here. Production numbers. We're up. We produced over almost 51 million bushels, total bushels, in Michigan last year. And I want to say that part of that is this yield right here. This is the highest dryland wheat yields in the nation. Okay, they can grow 110 bushels in Arizona. We know that's irrigated and it's spoon-fed. But this is a state average, so this is impressive. And I think this is all related to the management practices and the smart wheat growers that we have in Michigan. So really, it's outstanding. And this is the highest yield in our region, and we have the highest production in the region overall. So I think you guys are doing a great job. And so I want to help us to do a little bit better than that. I always want to try and beat Nebraska, but acres always trump yield. You know, we can have the highest yield, but we're never going to beat that kind of production, those acres. So now to varieties. So I'll be using this set of 8 varieties here, 4 white wheat varieties and 4 red wheat varieties here. Our whites are Ambassador, Jupiter, 9242W, AC Mountain. A lot of you will probably be familiar with these varieties. We have several years of data on them, so we've been taking a look at their performance over years. And then our red wheats are Red Dragon, Shirley, Sunburst, and a Pioneer line, 25R40. Now what I want to point out here is that there's a lot of variation due to year. A given variety will not perform the same year after year. So it's consistent, but it's variable, right? Year is a source of variation here. So we test all these data that I'll be talking about are online in the performance trial report here. So that's at varietytrials.msu.edu. So you can access all of this data that I'm going to be talking about today. So we have 6 different locations here, and they're all different. Varieties perform different by year and, of course, by location. And so you can see Ambassador here you can see an upward trend in yield, of course, with 2016 being an exceptional year in terms of yield. It's a little bit difficult to extract all the information just from the numbers. So I just want to give my disclaimer. I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm just talking about the numbers that we have generated on these varieties. So I'm not necessarily I don't have a horse in the race here, so to speak. So how I'd like to show this is just ranking them. Taking these 8 varieties and just ranking them 1 through 8 based on their yield potential. And in 2016, you can see that R40 was the highest yielding line, and Red Dragon was in the lower end of the scale. Now, if you look at 2014, okay, things changed a little bit. Red Dragon was the second highest yielding in 2014, and R40 again was the highest. But you can see this shift going from number 8 up to number 3 in 2016 for Shirley. So there's variability based on year. Now I want to get into the location variability, and this is important because we grow wheat across the state of Michigan, and that's why we tested so many different locations, is for you to actually base your decisions on the performance of a variety in your specific location. So we have 3 different locations in the thumb, and they're all different. Varieties perform differently in all, whether it's Huron, Tuscola, or Sanilac County. So it's important to make these, to consider the performance in a specific location. So again, here's the numbers, and this is just, again, the ranking within each location. So within Huron County, we have Ambassador, and that makes sense. It's a high-performance white wheat that's well adapted to the locations in which it's grown. Okay? Now, if you look at Ingham County here, you can see that the red wheat here, Pioneer 25R40, it's largely due to its development in more southern locations, in the more southern U.S. So varieties can move south to north fairly well. So a lot of the genetics we're testing were developed in places like Ohio, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, across the eastern U.S. And they move north fairly well. Now, I just want to further illustrate the variation here in yield performance. So you can see locations differ. Sanilac County, and I think that was the highest yielding location in our trials this year. It was amazing, 130, 140 values. So the 3-year average is upwards of 120 bushels here. But again, you can simply rank these and look and see that, of course, Ambassador and Jupiter are the highest yielding lines in Huron County, and in Tuscola County you have Red Dragon and R40 at the high end of the scale, but you also have Jupiter up there. So instead of looking at 94 different varieties, you can distill that down into a subset, a smaller list of varieties that you're potentially interested in. And there's something to be said about having a variety, consistent performance for a variety, but there are new varieties coming out all the time. The genetics do change for the better. And so this is what I was getting at, a method to use the performance in those different locations to make your decisions. So you'd want to first identify the location, or the locations. You take multiple locations. So if you're from western Michigan or southwestern Michigan, the best approximation would be probably Ingham County. Or if you're in Sanilac County, you can use the Sanilac County data. But if you're in somewhere like, let's say, Genesee County, it'd be good to take both the Tuscola and the Ingham and probably the Sanilac County data together. We can't necessarily test in every county in the state. I'd love to, and I know we could be testing more around the Isabella, Gratiot area, Montcalm area as well. But try to find data on a variety that's closest to where you are. So that's going to be more predictive of the performance of that variety on your farm. Granted, soil conditions vary, so it's always important to try these things out, not on a massive scale. I mean, you're all experts at risk management and doing things in a very careful manner, right? So, but it's worth trying on a small scale. So find your location, select a subset that you would be interested in, and then you can use a simple ranking to identify the top performing varieties in that location. So that's for yield potential. Another trait that we work very hard on in the breeding program is Fusarium head blight resistance. Now there is resistance. There's moderate levels of resistance, and I want to qualify that with the best control for scab is with a moderately resistant variety managed with a fungicide. That's the best way. It's the synergistic effect of those, both the genetics and the management. That's probably the scab resistance and control of scab is probably the best example of a genotype by management interaction for the better. Okay, so I want to point out these traits. So for 20 years now, with funds from the U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative, that's part of the ARS budget. So if you see a benefit from this, this is a great great example of a federally funded project, nationwide project that's been ongoing, where we can provide these data. So there are folks in every state that grows wheat that are evaluating these kinds of traits. So I would say the most important trait to look at would be DON. I mean, this is what you're evaluated on at the elevator. This is the actual mycotoxin level in the grain. And there's variation in all these traits among the wheat varieties that are available. So DON is the actual mycotoxin in ppm. So don't worry about the numbers. We deliberately infect these plants with the disease. So you can actually see, you can't actually, we deliberately infect corn. As you know, corn is a source of scab inoculum, so we deliberately infect the field and then we mist irrigate it to induce disease. So what the results that we get are our worst case scenario. And you can see there's some very, very susceptible plants here. Here's a susceptible. This is an old Pioneer line 25R45. It's a susceptible check. So we measure, for incidence, the frequency of infected heads within a single plot. So you guys are used to working with one or two varieties on thousands of acres. We work with thousands of varieties in one or two plots like this. So we look at a lot of different genetics. And so we evaluate them in these little these single rows. We've got custom drills where we can put in single rows plots here. So we're evaluating the first mycotoxin and then the number of heads that are infected. And you can see that this 60 to 80% of the spikes in this plot here, on the one on the far left, are infected with scab, versus the one in the middle, there are fewer heads infected. And that would be an incidence. That's just the percentage of infected heads in a plot. Now, severity is referring to the individual heads. You can see the image on the right there. There's variable infection on these. This spike here has about 50% versus maybe 30% in the others. And so we make an estimate of those spikes that are infected. How much of that spike is infected? Is it 3 florets or 5 or all of them in many cases? And that's presented as a percent as well, an average infection of individual spikes within a plot. And then FHB index just takes both of those together. So you get one number that incorporates how frequent is the infection and how severe is the infection then. And they're all very highly correlated. Okay, so if we didn't have the DON data, so we're always a year behind when we present the DON data. So we take samples from this inoculated nursery, thresh out the grain, and there's a lab at the University of Minnesota that does a chemical analysis and reports back to us. But we can't do that. We have about 2 weeks from when we harvest to when we publish the report every year. But we do have this data. So index is the most highly correlated. Just within this small data set that I've been working with, index is a pretty good predictor of mycotoxin as well as severity. Incidence is more related just to the variation in infection across the field. It's somewhat predictive. But when you use them both together in an index, if you don't have DON, index is the next best thing. And you can see the differences among these varieties too. So for DON mycotoxin, again, this is the same pattern where I have the highest DON level here is the reddest and the lowest is the greenest. So green is good in this case, red's bad. And you can see across in the best lines here, this is an example, 9242 has the second lowest DON concentration, but it's also quite good in terms of its the incidence. So it has fewer heads per plot infected. Has lower, when an individual head is infected, it's at a lower percentage, meaning that fungus isn't spreading through the whole spike. It's fighting its resistance. And then FHB index is lower as well. So if a line is good for one trait, it's usually good for all these traits. It has low DON, then it's usually also has lower incidence and lower severity, and therefore a lower index as well. So there is variation for scab resistance, and we do have a lot of lines. And so this was a survey. There was a survey done by Martin Nagelkirk, really led this effort, where we selected a bunch of varieties, and we surveyed you all on what you're actually planting. And I was thrilled to see that some of the most widely planted, white wheat and red wheat, and that's part of why I chose these varieties, because this is what, these are varieties that were surveyed to be grown on more acres. I was thrilled that Red Dragon and 9242 were on larger numbers of acres because of their scab resistance. That's risk. That's helping to mitigate risk then. Because we don't know if we didn't have scab last year. We sure did in parts of the state in 2015 and 2014. So it's something you just have to expect it and anticipate it. And that's something to take into consideration in variety selection. Okay, so I wanted to put this up here as a list of the seven lines, and this is that Dynagrow line that I couldn't remember at lunch today, 96, 92 here. These lines all have very low levels of DON, and as well as the other associated traits, but they also have high yield potential. So 2 lines are in the top 10 of 2016. Two of the top 10 highest yielding lines have extraordinary scab resistance. This is pretty good under worst case scenario. I mean, yeah, 3 ppm DON it's not good, but when you see the most susceptible are getting like 15 to 20 ppm, that's pretty good. That's a fraction of what it could be in the worst case scenario. And I threw 9242 in here as well, just to highlight that it is a white wheat, but it does have some moderate levels of scab resistance. So those resistant varieties are out there, and they perform fairly well. All right, so this is one that hasn't been around for a while, but we do collect the data every year. This is visual sprouting, pre-harvest sprouting, and I know this was the criteria before the falling number came around. The falling number and visual sprouting are related, but they're not exactly the same trait. So if we've been selecting on visual sprouting every year, I'm sure you're familiar with cases where you have low falling number, but on unsprouted grains. They're not necessarily the same trait. This is something Linda Brown works on if you want to pick her brain about that. We've investigated this, and they're not necessarily the same trait, but it's straightforward to evaluate these. You know, and we do see variation from limited sprouting to very, very high levels of sprouting. And as you may have heard out of Missouri and Illinois in 2015, red wheats can sprout. Okay, so there are certain red wheat genotypes. It's not a red-white thing. There are some red wheat genotypes that are susceptible to sprouting. That's not to scare anyone from not growing wheat at all, but it's something to consider, that it's something in both market classes. And I don't want to leave all these others off the table. So we don't get every disease in every year, but we collect all the data that we can when we have it. And well, black point is something we do collect every year, and that's just the black tip, the alternaria fungus that grows around the germ of the seed. And most varieties have some level of it, but they're usually all below the threshold of acceptability there. But stripe rust was a disease that we had that affected yields last year, and it was pointed out at the meeting in Richville this summer that, well, you could have disease susceptibility be a determinant in response to management. And guess what? That happened this year, where we had the most stripe rust susceptible varieties in the trials. We're the one. Guess what? They responded more to a fungicide treatment, which is kind of a no-brainer, but that shows up in that kind of data. But we do have that data available. Leaf rust, we do have some leaf rust data, and then of course the leaf blotch pathogens. Those of you that are spraying 2 or 3 fungicides, you don't have to be as concerned about this, but there is a genetic component to resistance. If you were only spraying at flowering, that's something to consider. And these viral diseases, there's some varieties that are less susceptible, but there's no real magic gene. There's no single gene that's conferring resistance to all these viruses. But there's a certain level of tolerance in the varieties that we have. And this is a very old one that shows up sporadically, if at all. We have one of our breeding nurseries. It's just a museum of diseases out there. So I really like that location because you get a look at the resistance. And so actually, 2014 was a great year for cephalosporium stripe at that location. So we have the data, not on every line, but on those. If that is something you are interested in, we do have the data. Okay. So I talked about yield potential, disease resistance, okay, which offense and defense, right? And so maturity is something to consider because it affects when you do these management practices. Okay, flowering date, That's important for fungicide applications, of course. So you can have up to 3 days, maybe 4, depending on the year, difference in flowering date for 2 different varieties. So it's very important to know when those varieties, so if you have 2 varieties on your farm, when those varieties are expected to flower relative to each other is important. Because if you have 2 of them, they're both flowering on the same day, you've got a lot of ground to cover, right? If you've got a 2-day window to spray, you've got a lot of ground to cover. Having different maturities is a way to kind of spread that out a little bit. It's a way to spread risk. And so maturity is important when you have multiple varieties. And then grain moisture at harvest, and that's pretty critical because you want to get that crop out of the field, especially white wheat, out of the field as soon as you can, without you want to get it out of the field without incurring too like drying costs, for example. Okay, but those are both related to maturity. And so you can see this difference here. Ambassador being and Pioneer 25R40, the lines, the genotypes in green here, the varieties in green, those are early maturity varieties. So you can see Ambassador, Red Dragon, and R40, they're flowering a little bit earlier. A half day is significant when you have multiple observations across locations here. Versus Jupiter, you can see it flowering 2 to 3 days. In reality, it'll be potentially 2 to 3 days later than the earlier varieties. And that usually translates into an early variety usually has lower moisture when we harvest. So when we're looking at 100 varieties, we can't necessarily harvest them on different days when they're, okay, this is optimum for this. So we have to we cast a wide net and harvest them all when most are ready to go. But you can see that maturity usually relates, early flowering usually relates to lower moisture at harvest. Okay. So another consideration when you're pushing wheat to its to its maximum, when you want to get the most out with management, something to consider is height. And it's no secret that the taller varieties are more susceptible to lodging. So, but there is a relationship between biomass. I've seen AC Mountain in the field for several years now, and it grows like trees. There's a lot of biomass there. It's tall. It's a very robust plant. And there's something to be said about storage of solutes, sugars in the stem that are transported to the filling grain in the last few days of grain fill. So there's a relationship with biomass, right? So tall plants, high biomass. But there's 9 inches of difference between the tallest and the shortest varieties among those available to growers. So you can cut 9 inches just based on genetics here. You can see Sunburst and Shirley are and R40 are on the shorter end. It's just short and early. It's kind of this little rhyme that you all short and early, just like Shirley. That we when we're making selections in our breeding nurseries, it's a trait that we're looking for. So you can see that you do have, and Jupiter is another example of a short variety that has. So there's more potential to. Potentially without a growth regulator. Growth regulators have their place. Don't get me wrong, but sometimes you can shorten plants based on genetics alone. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Does anybody have any comments, or we can take a pause for questions if you guys have any questions or comments about the different traits and the varieties. Yes, sir.
It's great you brought up about the sprouting. Can you do something to enhance the sprouting?
Absolutely. We simulate that. And so this is something through our endeavors here, you have to apply this treatment. So we go out, we walk these fields at physiological maturity when the peduncle, when it goes from green to amber, from green to yellow basically, that's the day when most of the plants in that plot are turning green to amber. It's a little bit finicky, but we harvest those. We dry them down for 5 days, bring them down to low moisture, and so it's under those conditions. So they're essentially, it's like it's been ready to harvest for 5 days. And then we mist them. We rain on the plants in the greenhouse. We have an irrigation system, several benches, and so we have hundreds of little bouquets of spikes that are bound together. And so it takes some labor to go through all of this. But then we go through and we rate them. So after we we dry them down 5 days, and then we rain on them for 3 days, and then we evaluate what happens. So this, worst case scenario, after this simulates essentially 3 days of straight rain at harvest maturity. So this really represents a worst case scenario for these varieties. Good question, thank you. Yes, sir?
Nitrogen rates, does that affect the full height?
It can, absolutely. Yeah, you can push them taller. That's usually what happens, and so they get lanky and they get top heavy then, and so they're more susceptible to winds then. Absolutely. So that's the function of a PGR or a stocky plant type that are shorter to the ground, where it's same biomass but it's more compact. It's able to handle that additional grain yield on top. Yeah. Anyone else? Good questions. Okay. Well, so we test varieties as a service and report that data, but we also develop varieties. So we're the only breeding program that's actually selecting varieties in Michigan. And so breeding is a long-term investment. And so the breeding program at MSU has been around for decades. And so when I started in 2013, I was able to go to the field into the existing program and make selections with my eye and the breeder's eye that you've heard about. But I was able to walk into an existing program and keep it going and take it to the next level here. So this is our trial site at Richville. It's a little bit different. I mentioned that we work with thousands of plots. So we had 2,500 different research plots, and each of these little squares you can see, that's one variety. So we test 1,000 new potential varieties each year in 2 locations, in Richville and down south in Ingham County. So this was actually from Google Earth. You can see this from the satellites. But this is some precision planting with our GPS that we have on our planter. So these are the winter wheats, and we are testing a small set of soft white spring wheats. I'm not going to say much about that today, but you can actually see that they're about 2 weeks behind the winter wheats here. So these are the lines that we have. We are about 2 years away from having these available for you to grow. And we always compare things relative to a check. So this is Ambassador, and these are under, it's only 90 pounds of total N as urea, and with no fungicide applications too. So these are just left to the world to face all the pathogens and pressures that exist out there. We have some very high yielding white wheats that we're outperforming the existing varieties that are out there. We are using some of the same pedigrees though. I'm very enthusiastic about this Ambassador Jupiter cross. Very good yield potential, and it's got the whole package. It's usually you get sprout tolerance or scab resistance. Well, so we're getting to the point where it's sprout tolerance and scab resistance, yield potential and scab resistance. So this is our set of white wheats that we're working with. We also work with red wheats as well. They're all performing very well here. And these 2 guys at the bottom, they're not that much better than Ambassador, and that's exactly why in our advanced yield trials, so these are our second year of yield trials, we're applying fungicides. They're very susceptible to stripe rust, but in Ohio, under fungicide management, you're yielding 7 bushels higher than the Pioneer 25R40 was the check down south. So that's the red wheats and the white wheats that we have in the pipeline. And like I said, these are about 2 years from being in production. So I mentioned, so these are all the traits that I talked about earlier. Yield potential, of course, and so we do have some. There's still some that are susceptible to mycotoxin. Okay, but this line W64 that I mentioned, good yield potential, relatively low levels of DON. And I know 5 ppm looks like a lot, but you compare that to the 15 ppm that's possible in Ambassador, it's a fraction. Reduced sprouting, but we do have some stripe rust resistance in the program that I didn't expect. Jupiter has good stripe rust resistance. Any of you remember D8006, that old white wheat line? That has stripe rust resistance, so it's in the pedigrees of some of these lines that's coming through now. We've never had stripe rust pressure, so we would have never been able to identify it previously. And again, here's our red wheats, good yield potential, and this is why I kept these 2 lines in the program. Very, very low DON. This is a classic. We call it a type 3 resistance to the accumulation of mycotoxin in the grain. Okay, and I'd like to thank all those groups that have sponsored the program, the milling organizations, crop improvement, and Michigan Wheat Program is really the reason we're able to do things on the scale that we do them, and hopefully that we can have that impact and deliver these higher yielding varieties to you all, the farmers. And so this wouldn't be possible without a good crew here. 4 fantastic graduate students, technicians, and a postdoc in the group. And Martin has always been good with. It's good to interact with Martin and Dennis. Actually, Dennis has put a database together, and I'm sorry I didn't put that up there. So these are available with a searchable database as well. So we're producing a lot of information, and I hopefully today I've given you a way to look at that information and make it more useful to you. Thank you. I'll take any other questions you might have. Thank you. Yes, sir.
That last chart you had, the MI brands, are those all Michigan State?
Those are Michigan State lines, yeah. So we have 23 new lines altogether, and those are being tested head-to-head, if you will, with. They haven't been named yet. They don't have a variety name, but they are being tested in the commercial trials this year.